Hi and welcome. You are listening to Listen and Relax. Sit back and enjoy these online dating stories. If you want us to continue making these videos, please let us know in the comments what you think about the stories and if we should continue. Please comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated when we post new exciting stories. These stories about strange coworkers are all based on true stories. Thank you for listening. The dishwasher who didn't see the dirt. I used to work in a place where cleanliness was key, especially in the kitchen. It wasn't a glamorous job, but someone had to do it, and I was often the one who made sure the place stayed tidy, from the countertops to the dishes. But there was one colleague, let's call her Lily, who was in charge of washing the dishes. The thing about Lily was she never seemed to notice the dirt. No matter how much ground was left behind, or how messy the kitchen looked after she'd been there, she always thought it was good enough. At first, I didn't mind too much. I figured maybe she just needed a bit of guidance, but after a while, it became clear she didn't see it. She really didn't see the mess. One day, after she had finished her shift and I was about to start mine, I decided to check the kitchen just to make sure everything was clean. What I found was shocking. The sink was full of leftover food scraps, chunks of meat, old vegetable peelings, things that should have been wiped away long ago. The countertops, which should have been spotless, were covered with wilted lettuce and other salad debris. And then there was the worst part, the slicer. The industrial slicer used to cut meats and veggies was coated with a layer of greasy, dirty water. It was a nightmare. I was frustrated. We all know how important it is to keep a kitchen clean, especially in places where food is prepared. A dirty slicer, that's a health hazard. I couldn't just leave it like that. I decided to go find Lily and bring her back to the kitchen. I asked her, "Do you see what I'm talking about?" She looked around, seemingly bewildered. "What do you mean?" "It looks fine to me," she said. I cleaned up. I couldn't believe it. She genuinely thought everything was fine. But no, it wasn't. There were meat scraps on the counter, the slicer was gross, and the sink was a mess. She hadn't cleaned it properly at all. I had to call in another colleague to clean the slicer, since it needed special attention. It wasn't just about wiping it down. Slicers need to be cleaned with fresh, clean water, no shortcuts. I knew I couldn't let this slide, so I reported it to my boss. I explained the situation, that I had to intervene and get another person to clean the slicer because Lily just didn't see the problem. My boss listened, but when I finished explaining, he just said, "Well, June, she can't leave yet. You shouldn't throw away old shoes before you have new ones." I didn't know how to respond to that, but I wasn't going to back down. "Sometimes it's better to walk barefoot," I said, half joking, half serious. 2 days later, I heard the news. Lily was gone. She'd been fired. When one of my colleagues asked my boss why she was let go, he responded, "It had to be done." It was June's call. It was an awkward moment, to say the least. I didn't want to be the one to make the final decision. But the truth was, I couldn't ignore the health risks anymore. I did feel bad for her, honestly. She didn't mean any harm. She genuinely wanted to do her job well. But when you're working in an environment like that, where cleanliness is everything, you can't afford to miss the basics. A dishwasher who doesn't understand the importance of cleanliness, that's not something that can be overlooked. But I couldn't help feeling conflicted. It wasn't a decision I had wanted to make, but sometimes when you see something that's just not right, you have to take action. It wasn't personal, it was about keeping everyone safe. And honestly, it felt like a turning point for me. I learned that sometimes doing the right thing isn't always the easiest thing, and it can put you in tough situations. But in the end, I knew I had to stand by the choices I made, even if they were difficult. The stubborn teacher who couldn't be helped. It's always tough when there's a staffing issue at work. We all know how hard it can be to find the right person for the job, especially when it comes to teaching. For the past 2 years, the English department at our school has been in desperate need of a replacement. Every year, we've been stuck with the same situation. Good candidates were few and far between, and the best we could get was, well, someone who wasn't exactly ideal. Her name's Mrs. Harrison, and I'm sure she meant well when she was called back to help us. But let me tell you, she's a tough one to work with. She's retired, hard of hearing, and to be honest, a bit set in her ways. And that's putting it lightly. She just doesn't get the modern world, especially when it comes to technology. She's been teaching in the classroom next to mine for 2 years now, and I can't count the number of times she's come over to ask me the same questions about the computer systems. Where do I go to report this issue? She'd ask. Why won't the computer let me do this? Every time, it's the same questions, and every time I find myself explaining things I've already told her 100 times. It's frustrating, but at the same time, I know she's trying. It's just hard for her to adapt. And that's something I've come to accept. But there was one situation last year that really made me question her ability to help students. It was the end of the school year, and there was a student in my class, Emma, who needed to make up an English exam to pass. She had failed it, and now she was left with the difficult task of turning her grade around. The problem was she had to jump from a 5 to a solid 7 to even have a chance at passing. It wasn't going to be easy, and we all knew that. Now, Mrs. Harrison had offered to help the students who needed it. At first, I thought it was a kind gesture. She was offering to give extra help, and that could make a difference for students like Emma. But then, when I heard what happened between her and Emma, I was shocked. Emma, already feeling down about having to redo the exam, was trying her best to stay positive. But Mrs. Harrison, with all her years of experience, didn't seem to understand the importance of encouragement. Instead of offering Emma some much-needed support, she told her point blank that there was no way she was going to make that grade. I overheard the conversation, and it took everything in me not to intervene. Mrs. Harrison was telling Emma that a 7 was impossible, that she shouldn't even bother trying. You're not going to make it, she said, so I'm not going to waste my energy helping you. Can you imagine how crushing that must have been for Emma? She was already struggling with the idea of needing a miracle to pass, and here was this teacher telling her that it wasn't even worth trying. It was one of the most heartless things I've ever witnessed in the workplace. I was speechless when I heard it. How could she say that to a student, especially one who was already in a vulnerable position, trying to make up for a failing grade? It felt like a betrayal to Emma's effort and to her future. I couldn't just let that slide, but at the same time, what could I do? Mrs. Harrison was the teacher in this situation. It wasn't my place to step in every time she said something wrong, but this time, it felt like too much. As expected, Emma didn't pass. I'm not saying it was all Mrs. Harrison's fault, but how could anyone expect a student to improve when they're being told it's impossible? That's not how you motivate students, especially not those who are already struggling. The whole situation left me with a bad taste in my mouth. It wasn't just Emma who was affected, it was the whole class. Her attitude was toxic, and it seeped into the work environment, affecting the morale of everyone involved. And it wasn't just the students who suffered. The rest of us were trying to work with someone who clearly had no understanding of the modern educational environment or of how to nurture students. In the end, Mrs. Harrison didn't stay much longer. It wasn't a surprise to anyone when we heard she was leaving. I think it was the right decision, though. I just hope the next person we get for the job can offer a little more support and understanding, because this time it really felt like we were stuck with someone who couldn't see past her own stubbornness. Sometimes people get too comfortable with the way things were and refuse to change. But the truth is, in teaching, you have to evolve with the times. You have to be able to adapt. And when you can't do that, well, that's when you start failing your students. The representative who was hiding a secret. It's funny how sometimes the people you work with can surprise you in ways you never expect. And then there are times when something happens that shakes the whole office to its core. That's exactly what happened with a colleague of mine. Someone who seemed perfectly normal on the surface, but turned out to have a secret that no one could have imagined. This colleague, let's call him Peter, had been hired as a sales representative for our company. He was supposed to go out and meet clients, pitch our services, and close deals. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Well, there was one thing about Peter that always struck me as odd. He was given a company car, something every sales rep needed for their job. But instead of driving the car to work, Peter would always come in on his bicycle. He lived quite a distance away, so it was strange to see him arrive on his bike every single day. We all joked about it, but it didn't seem like a huge deal at first. Then something strange started happening. My boss had an app that tracked the mileage of the company cars. It was meant to ensure that they were being used properly, keeping tabs on fuel and maintenance. But when my boss checked the app one day, something didn't add up. Peter's car had logged an astonishing 40,000 kilometers in just 2 months. That's a lot of miles for someone who only commutes to work on a bike. Nobody knew what was going on, and to be honest, we were all a bit suspicious. But the real shock came when one of my colleagues had to go with Peter to a client meeting. It was a young girl who had just started working with us. She was eager to prove herself and make a good impression. The arrangement was that Peter would pick her up from the office and drive her to the client's location. They left together, and hours later, they returned. But when they walked back into the office, something seemed off. My boss, always keen on getting to the bottom of things, decided to ask the young girl a simple question. "Did Peter drive you to the client meeting?" Her face went pale, and before anyone could react, she started crying. She turned around and bolted out of the office. My boss was taken aback by her reaction and followed her outside to see if she was okay. But the girl refused to speak to anyone. Confused and concerned, my boss decided to dig a little deeper. After some careful questioning, the truth came out. It turned out that Peter hadn't driven the girl to the meeting at all. Instead, he had arranged for his father to come and pick her up. But that wasn't even the worst part. As it turned out, Peter had threatened the young girl, warning her not to tell anyone that he hadn't driven. He made it clear that if she said anything, there would be consequences. What was going on? My boss was stunned. He pushed for more answers, and eventually, the story unfolded. Peter had lost his driver's license several years ago due to a DUI. In fact, he had caused a car accident while driving under the influence. But instead of being upfront about it, Peter had forged the paperwork to get a company car. He had submitted his girlfriend's driver's license information, pretending that it was his own, and had somehow convinced the company to approve his request for the vehicle. But that wasn't all. The real kicker was that Peter had been using his father as a chauffeur. His dad had been driving the company car around, probably even doing some sort of side hustle like Uber, given the number of kilometers the car had racked up. The entire office was in shock. Not only had Peter been lying about his driving credentials, but he had also used a seat to secure a company vehicle and had put an innocent colleague in a position where she felt scared to speak up. It was a complete betrayal of trust. Needless to say, Peter was fired immediately. The whole situation was a mess, and my boss had no choice but to let him go. The young girl, who had been so eager to impress, was left shaken by the whole ordeal. She'd been manipulated by someone she had trusted, and it was heartbreaking to see her so upset. As for Peter, well, he left the company, but his actions didn't just affect him. The damage was done. His lies and deceit had left a trail of broken trust and confusion, and it would be a long time before anyone in the office could forget the shock of what had really been happening behind the scenes. The creepy colleague. A few years ago, I worked with a guy named Terry. He wasn't the most obviously frightening person you'd encounter at first glance, but something about him just felt off. He always seemed so sweet, polite, and friendly, but there was something unsettling about the way he interacted with the women in the office. His kindness always had a strange undertone, like it was hiding something darker. I wouldn't go as far as calling him a predator, but his behavior was definitely creepy at times, to say the least. One of the most disturbing things he did was the way he would look at us, particularly the younger women. He'd be overly charming, and when I say overly, I mean it in the most uncomfortable way. He'd ask very personal and often inappropriate questions under the guise of being friendly. It was subtle at first, but you couldn't ignore that something wasn't right. I remember one morning, I walked into work wearing a blue dress. It was nothing special, just something I liked, but the moment I sat down at my desk, it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I opened my emails as usual, trying to get into the groove of the day, and then I saw it. The last email in my inbox had come from Thierry. The subject line read, "You look beautiful in that dress." The email itself was completely empty, nothing but that subject line. I was frozen. He hadn't even said good morning to me, hadn't come up to me like he usually did to chat. No, he had just sat in his office, staring at me, and then sent me that. It was beyond weird. I can't even describe the chill that ran down my spine at that moment. I deleted the email immediately, but the unease lingered all day. But it didn't stop there. Cherry would often go out of his way to do little things that should have been nice but always felt wrong. I remember one time he gave me a bottle of wine. I had mentioned once, in passing, that I enjoyed wine, but I didn't expect him to act on it in such a strange way. He came up to me at my desk, acting all casual, and slipped the bottle into a plastic bag before handing it to me. He did it so sneakily, like he didn't want anyone to see. Here, I thought you might like this, he said, his tone almost too sweet. It felt like a gift, but also like a warning. What made it worse was that no one else ever noticed his behavior. On the surface, he was just this harmless, polite guy, someone who liked to have casual chats with people. But when you were around him for too long, you could sense that something was off. Something wasn't right about the way he would stand just a little too close, or the way his eyes would linger just a second too long. I often wondered if anyone else saw what I saw, or if I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew. I knew Cherry wasn't as harmless as he pretended to be. Then, not too long ago, we had a reunion for our old workplace. We all gathered together, catching up on old times, and I was looking forward to seeing everyone. But then, during the night, I learned something that shook me to my core. Cherry, the same Cherry who had always made me uncomfortable, had passed away. He'd gone to sleep after his birthday party and never woke up. It hit me harder than I expected. Yes, I had always found him creepy. And yes, I'd been relieved to leave that office behind. But to hear that he was gone, to realize that I would never have to deal with him again, it felt like a weight was lifting off my shoulders. And yet, it left me with a strange guilt. I wouldn't wish anyone's death, not even someone like Thierry. But knowing he was gone, knowing that I would never get another strange email from him or feel that uncomfortable gaze, it made me realize just how much his presence had haunted me. Sometimes you never really know who's walking past you in the hall, who's sitting at the desk next to you, or who's sending you those unsettling emails. The world is full of people with secrets. And sometimes when those secrets finally come to light, it's far too late to undo the things they've done. The girl who couldn't stand food waste. It was a busy Thursday evening when I remembered a story from my old job. I was working at a cafe owned by a guy named Elliot. He had not one, but two cafes, and the one I worked at was just across the street from his other location. The cafe had a tight-knit team, and everyone was pretty chill except for one person, a girl who had joined a few years ago. Her name was Sarah. At first, Sarah seemed like the kind of person who would fit right in. She was quiet, hardworking, and had this kind of gentle demeanor. She was eager to help and always seemed to care about the little details that mattered in the cafe world. But there was something about her that never quite sat right with me. You see, Sarah had this thing. She had a very peculiar stance when it came to food waste. She couldn't stand it. Now, I get it, we all agree that wasting food is a terrible thing, especially in a place like a cafe where there's always something left on plates and in cups. But Sarah took it to an extreme that over time became something far creepier than admirable. It started off small. If a customer left the smallest sip of coffee in their cup or a sliver of cake on their plate, Sarah would swoop in like clockwork, grabbing the abandoned items before anyone could stop her. The first time I noticed it, she took a half-finished glass of latte and casually drank it down as if it were completely normal. I remember looking over at her and thinking, did she really just do that? She did it all the time. It wasn't just an occasional thing either. Every time a customer left something behind, Sarah would eagerly jump in, drinking the leftover coffee, finishing the last bites of a sandwich, or even licking the butter off leftover bread. It became a pattern that no one could ignore. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe she was just being frugal, or maybe she was genuinely trying to minimize food waste. But then it started to feel wrong. I saw it happen more and more, her picking through leftovers like it was her personal buffet. At first, it was just the scraps she could quickly finish, but soon enough, she was keeping everything. She'd go to the back where we kept the leftover food and gather all the bits and pieces from plates, glasses, and unfinished dishes. After a shift, when the cafe quieted down, she would take her stash to the staff room, sit by herself, and eat everything she could find. Leftover fries, bread with butter, half-eaten salads, even bits of pasta and soup. The odd part was that she didn't seem embarrassed by it. She didn't even try to hide it. In fact, she seemed proud of herself. I remember one night in particular when I walked into the staff room after my shift to grab my bag, and there she was, sitting at the small table with a plate piled high with leftover food. She had bread, herbs, butter, a few leftover chicken wings, and even a small glass of wine someone had left behind. She was just sitting there, eating everything as though she were at a feast, smiling to herself. And all around her were dirty dishes, glasses, and a few uneaten leftovers, which she was methodically finishing off. It wasn't like a casual snack. It was like she was ravenous, devouring everything that had been left behind. And the worst part, the guests could see her too. They were right there, sitting at the bar or at the tables, watching her as she picked through their leftovers. Some of them even looked uncomfortable, but Sarah didn't seem to care. She would smile at them and say, "Well, they didn't want it, right? I can't let it go to waste." It wasn't long before the weirdness of it all became impossible to ignore. I started hearing murmurs from the other staff members. "Did you see Sarah again today?" one of the baristas would say. She had 3 cups of leftover coffee in front of her. Another one would add, "She even finished someone's leftover burger and fries right from the plate." And while everyone else was growing uncomfortable, Sarah just kept doing it, day in and day out. She would consume whatever was left behind, as though it were her duty to make sure no food went uneaten, no drink went unfinished. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to Elliot, the cafe owner. I don't know what they were discussing, but I caught the words, "I just can't let it go to waste, Elliot. It's all going to the trash, and I can't stand it. It feels wrong." Elliot seemed to nod, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't sure how to handle it. After all, it was a tricky situation. She wasn't stealing from the cafe. She wasn't taking food that wasn't meant for her, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way she went about it. It felt like she had crossed some line between saving food and obsession. One evening, just before closing time, I had a moment of clarity. Sarah had gone into the staff room again to finish off what she had gathered from the evening's leftovers. As I was cleaning up the counter, I glanced back into the room. There she was again, alone, surrounded by half-drunk glasses and leftover sandwiches, picking through everything like it was a ritual. It hit me then. This wasn't just about saving food. It was more than that. She was obsessed with it. The way she looked at the food, the way she devoured it without hesitation, like it was the last meal she'd ever have. It wasn't healthy, not by any means. The next day, Sarah wasn't there. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was sick or had a personal issue. But the following week, it became clear. She had quit the job. No one ever really spoke about it, but I got the sense that Elliot had quietly let her go. I wasn't sure if it was because of the way she treated the food or if something else had happened, but she was gone. It's strange, though. Every now and then, when I see food left over in the cafe, or when I catch a glimpse of a half-finished coffee cup, I think back to Sarah and wonder what really went on in her mind. Was it truly about saving food? Or was there something darker in her obsession? Sometimes the line between being environmentally conscious and crossing into something far more unsettling can be thin. And with Sarah, I think she crossed it. The colleague who couldn't take a joke. It was one of those days at work when nothing seemed to go right, but one thing stuck with me for weeks. It started out innocently enough. We were just going through the usual office routine, dealing with reports, emails, the endless pile of paperwork. But then something happened. Something that turned a normal day into one filled with tension and silent resentment. I had a colleague, let's call her Anne, and was around 60. And well, she was different. She'd always been a quiet type, a little awkward in social situations, and had never really fit in with the rest of the team. You could tell that she had lived a very sheltered life, one where things had always been a bit too controlled and predictable. She wasn't great with humor, and even the slightest joke could send her into a spiral of hurt feelings. But this story is about something far more serious. An issue that started with a simple card. One of our colleagues, let's call him S, had recently lost his father. Naturally, the whole office wanted to send him their condolences, so I went out and bought a card for everyone to sign. I had the best intentions. I wanted to make sure S knew we were thinking of him during such a difficult time. My boss, who was generally quite laid back, suggested that I send the card around the office so everyone could write a personal message. So I did. I passed it around, and people signed it throughout the day. Everything was going smoothly, until the end of the day when I realized that and hadn't been at her desk. By the time I received the card back, It had been signed by almost everyone, and I quickly glanced over it to make sure everything was in order before I sent it off. The next morning, just as I was starting my work, Anne came up to me. Her face was flushed, and I could tell something was wrong. She didn't even say hello before launching into her question. I heard there was a card for S that went around yesterday, she said, her voice tight. Can I still write something on it? I paused, a bit taken aback by the sudden request. I had already mailed it. I tried to explain this to her as gently as I could. I'm sorry, but the card already went out this morning. Her face shifted from curiosity to something darker, something sharp. What do you mean it already went out? You didn't think to wait for me? She shook her head, clearly frustrated. That's really something. You didn't even give me a chance to wish him well. Her voice was rising now. I thought I could count on my colleagues to treat me with respect. I was stunned. I hadn't expected this reaction. I tried to remain calm, but it was like speaking to a wall. I'm really sorry, and I said. I didn't think it would be a big deal. We can always send us another card if you'd like. But she wasn't having it. She snapped, no, it's too late now. You've made your decision, haven't you? And with that, she stormed off, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The whole thing left me feeling uneasy. I mean, yes, it was a little unfortunate that she didn't get a chance to sign the card, but her reaction felt off. It wasn't just about the card, it was something deeper. A few hours later, my boss came over to me. I heard what happened, he said, looking uncomfortable. I talked to Anne. I didn't want her to feel ignored, so I had a word with her. It was clear he was trying to smooth things over, but I could tell it made the situation even more awkward. Thanks, I said, though I wasn't sure how I felt about it. I didn't want to seem petty, but I didn't think I'd done anything wrong. Not long after, Anne came over to me again. This time, she was trying to make amends, though it wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology. I just want to apologize for earlier, she said, looking me in the eye. But don't think I didn't notice what happened. Her finger was pointed directly at me, almost accusingly. And you'd better not tell anyone about this. Don't even think about mentioning it to anyone. It was the way she said it, the way her eyes narrowed as she delivered her words, that made my skin crawl. There was a certain finality to it, as though I had no choice but to accept her version of the story. The entire office felt different after that day, and continued to keep her distance, and I didn't exactly feel like talking to her either. But it wasn't just the tension between us. It was the way she made everything feel so uncomfortable. Her inability to take a joke, her overreaction to the smallest things, the subtle but unnerving way she wielded power in the office. It was all beginning to add up. A week later, we had a team lunch at the company cafeteria. Everyone was gathered, talking and laughing as usual. But then something happened, and had gone up to the counter to pay for her food, and when she came back to find a seat, there was a problem. The cafeteria wasn't exactly the largest space, and with the whole team there, finding a table that could fit us all wasn't easy. And approached a man sitting at the biggest table. She asked him if we could join him. The man, who was just finishing his meal, said, "Sure, take the table. I'm done anyway." As and walked back to our group, a couple of colleagues jokingly said, "Did you just chase him away?" And the joke was innocent enough, but Anne took it differently. She stopped, her face turning red with frustration. "No, I didn't chase him away." She snapped. "I just asked if we could join him and he walked off." Her voice trembled with anger. Another colleague, trying to keep things light, asked, "How exactly did you ask him? What did you say?" Anne's eyes narrowed even further. "I didn't do anything wrong. Just leave me alone." Then, without another word, she grabbed her tray and stormed out of the cafeteria. The room went silent.